Nobody warns you that the scariest sentence in a marriage isn't, "I don't love you anymore." It's, "So when do we get to see the new house?" Asked by a woman who has no business knowing there is a new house at all. I'm 29. I own 4 rental properties across 2 counties, and none of them have my husband's name on the deed. He thinks I do freelance bookkeeping from home. That's not exactly a lie. I do keep books, mostly my own, but it's not the truth either, and I built that gap between the two on purpose, the way you build a retaining wall before the water gets high. I should probably explain why. I grew up in a house where money disappeared and nobody would say where. My father worked construction, my mother worked at a dental office, and somehow we were always 3 days from the electric bill getting shut off. I found out much later that my father had a habit. Nothing dramatic, no casinos, just a slow bleed of investments that never paid off, and a temper that got worse every time my mother asked about it. I left home at 18, and I did not look back in any romantic sense. I called my mother on her birthday. That's the whole relationship. I was bad with people for a long time after that. Not shy exactly. I could hold a conversation if I had to, but wary, like I was always doing math on what a person wanted from me before I let them get close. I worked temp admin jobs through my early 20s, got laid off twice, and somewhere in there a coworker talked me into putting $400 into a stock she liked. It tripled in 8 months. That was the beginning of the end of my temp job era. By 25, I'd found my way into real estate, small multifamily properties, the unglamorous kind nobody fights you for at auction, and by 27, I didn't need an employer anymore. I never told anyone that. Not friends, not the handful of family I still spoke to. Money makes people different around you, and I had exactly 0 interest in finding out who my friends would become if they knew what my bank account looked like. Then there was Weston. We met at a 24-hour diner near my apartment, the kind of place with sticky menus, and a waitress named Donna who'd worked there since before I was born. I went most nights after closing my laptop, not because I needed to eat that late, but because I needed to be around noise that wasn't mine. Weston worked the closing shift at a hardware store 2 blocks over and came in still smelling like sawdust. Always ordering the same thing. Patty melt, side of fries. Coffee never finished. The first time he talked to me, I didn't answer. He said something about how the diner's coffee was worse than paint thinner, but somehow he still needed 4 cups a night to get through the walk home, and I just nodded and kept eating. He wasn't discouraged. He kept talking every night about nothing. His manager, a customer who'd tried to return a lawnmower after using it for a full season, whatever game had been on the TV mounted over the counter. I want to be honest about something, because the audience I'm imagining right now is probably asking the same question people always ask me. Why did I let a stranger talk at me for 2 years before I gave him the time of day? The truth is less romantic than people want. I wasn't lonely for him specifically. I was lonely for the sound of another human voice that didn't want anything from me. He never asked me questions. He just talked, and I got to exist next to it, and that was the first version of company I'd had in years that didn't feel like a transaction. I could have switched diners. There were 2 others within walking distance. I didn't, because some small stubborn part of me had gotten used to that noise, and I didn't want to give it up. When he finally asked me to dinner, an actual dinner, not diner food, I almost said no out of habit. Then I thought, what's the harm in one meal? And I said yes. He was easier to be around outside of work talk than I expected. Funnier, a little self-deprecating in a way that didn't feel performative. He asked me out again, and I kept saying yes, mostly because it never asked anything of me that I wasn't willing to give. 6 months in, he told me he loved me. A year in, he proposed in the diner parking lot, which I actually thought was sweet in an unpolished way. I said yes. I told him I did freelance data entry and bookkeeping for small businesses. I told him the 1-bedroom condo we moved into together was something I'd gotten a good deal on. Both were technically true. What I didn't tell him was that I owned it outright, that I owned 3 other properties that funded the mortgage-free lifestyle he thought was just frugal living, or that if he quit the hardware store tomorrow, our life wouldn't change by a single dollar. I told myself I was protecting the relationship. If he knew, I reasoned, he'd either resent me for out-earning him by that much, or he'd stop trying, stop working, stop having ambition, and just fold into being supported. I'd seen it happen to a friend of mine. I didn't want to find out which version of Weston that would create. We didn't have a big wedding. City Hall, then dinner with his family, because my side of the family didn't really warrant an invitation, and he understood that without me having to explain it in detail. His family wanted the full introduction. His mother's name was Carol. His father was Frank. He had 1 younger sister, Brittany, who'd moved back in with their parents after her own divorce, with a 6-year-old in tow. It was a full house, 5 people under one roof in a 3-bedroom rambler that had clearly seen better decades. The first real family dinner, Brittany did most of the talking, curious in that friendly-seeming way that's actually reconnaissance. What do you do for work? Where'd you grow up? How'd you afford the condo? I gave vague, boring answers, the kind designed to close a conversation rather than open one. It mostly worked until Carol leaned in. "You bought that condo yourself?" "At your age," she said, smiling like she already had a theory. "Did your parents help you with that?" I did the math on the lie in about a second and a half and said yes, my parents had helped. It felt cleaner than explaining that I've built it from a stock tip and a decade of quiet discipline. Carol's whole posture changed. She wanted to know what my father did for work. I told her he was in construction, which was true, and watched her visibly recalibrate. Construction wasn't the answer she wanted, and I could see her trying to reconcile construction worker's daughter with owns a condo at 26. Brittany picked up where her mother left off. "Must be nice having family who can just buy you a place like that," she said, and there was an edge under the friendliness now, thin but real. "If your parents are that comfortable, maybe they could help us out too. This house is a lot for 5 people." I remember looking around that living room, the water stain on the ceiling, the recliner with duct tape on one arm, 3 generations packed into a house built for a family half that size, and feeling a flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite pity. I had no intention of funding a renovation for people I'd met twice. But I also didn't correct the story. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, because it was easier than the alternative, and because some instinct told me the truth would cost me more than the lie ever would. I was wrong about how much the lie would cost me, too. I just didn't know it yet. From that dinner on, Carol and Brittany operated on the assumption that I came from money and was sitting on more of it than I was willing to share. It started small, a request for $200 to cover Brittany's car repair, funneled through it in because apparently they felt more comfortable asking their son than asking me directly. I said no the first time. Weston came back looking pained and said he'd covered it himself, and could I maybe just reimburse him, since it would smooth things over with his mom. I want to be clear. I noticed the pattern immediately. I am not a naive person. But $200 didn't move the needle for me financially, and I told myself the piece was worth more than the principal. That calculation would come back to bite me, because in my experience, and I'd now recommend this to anyone listening, the first time you pay to avoid a fight, you're not buying peace. You're setting a price for future fights. The requests kept coming, never large, always through Weston, always with some soft emotional pressure attached. Brittany's behind on rent, Carol needs new glasses, Frank's truck needs a transmission. I lent, reluctantly, maybe 11 or 12 times over the first year and a half of the marriage, small amounts that added up to a few $1,000s I never expected to see again. Weston always looked apologetic when he asked. He never once suggested I say no. His job situation didn't help. He worked in sales at the hardware store's contractor division, mostly commission-based, and a slow season hit hard. His paycheck shrank. It genuinely didn't affect our household. My income covered everything without strain, but I watched it wear on him in a way I didn't fully register as dangerous at the time. A man who grew up watching his parents struggle for money doesn't handle being the lower earner gracefully, even when nobody's counting. The turning point, if I had to pick one, was the house. There was new construction going up next to our building, a mixed-use tower that was going to block our afternoon light for the next 2 years of construction and permanently after that. I mentioned it to Weston, half joking, that we might want to think about moving once it went up. He shrugged it off. I didn't shrug it off. I called my usual agent, a guy named Doyle who'd found me 2 of my 4 properties, and told him to keep an eye out for something with better long-term value. Doyle found a 5-bedroom colonial about 20 minutes out, a genuinely beautiful property, fully renovated, single level with an accessible layout, the kind of house that would be perfect for an aging family or a big household. Way outside what I needed for myself, but exactly the kind of asset that would rent well long-term or resell even better once the area finished developing. I decided to buy it purely as an investment. I had no plans to live there. I had 0 plans to tell Weston's family about it. Obviously, the last thing I needed was Carol hearing 5-bedroom house and doing what I now know she was fully capable of doing with that information. The paperwork for the purchase, inspection reports, the purchase agreement, financing documents, sat in a folder on our kitchen table for exactly 1 evening while I finished reviewing it. I made the mistake of leaving it there overnight instead of putting it back in my office. Weston found it. And instead of asking me about it, he did something I still can't fully explain. Even now, he took photos of the documents on his phone and, as I found out much later, showed those photos to his mother. I didn't know any of that had happened. What I noticed was a shift in Weston's behavior over the following 2 weeks. He started cooking dinner without being asked. He did the dishes every night. He signed up, unprompted, to handle the grocery shopping, something he'd avoided for the entire marriage. When I asked what had gotten into him, he laughed it off. Just trying to be a better partner, that's all. And I let it go because who questions their spouse suddenly doing more? In hindsight, he wasn't trying to be a better partner. He was trying to be a better partner to someone he believed was about to move his whole family into a 5-bedroom house. About 3 weeks after that, he quit his job. Sales isn't really it for me, he said, like he was announcing a minor scheduling change. I've been feeling burned out. I want to take some time to figure out what's next. I wasn't panicked about the money. Our finances could absorb him not working for a while without me even adjusting my spending. What worried me was the complete absence of any actual job search. Days passed, then 2 weeks. He wasn't updating a resume, he wasn't taking calls with recruiters, he was mostly on his phone or watching TV. When I gently asked if he'd started looking, he snapped at me in a way that was completely out of character. I'm applying to places, okay? I'm still dealing with burnout, you don't get to rush that, and stormed off to the bedroom. I let it sit for another week. Then, out of nowhere, he came to me almost cheerful, practically glowing, and told me he wasn't going back into sales at all. He'd found his real path, currency trading. He showed me his phone, a screen full of screenshots from some forum, men posting 5-figure wins from leveraged FX trades. I just need a little seed money to start, he said. Even a couple thousand. I've been reading about this for weeks. I really think I can do this. I told him, as gently and firmly as I could, that the people posting those screenshots were the survivors of a much larger pool of people who'd lost money and gone quiet about it. Survivorship bias, basically, though I didn't use that phrase with him. I said no. He pushed. I said no again, pointed out that we'd never seen a cent back from the money already loaned to his mother and sister, and that I wasn't going to compound bad debt with more bad debt. He used his own severance and a chunk of savings to trade anyway, without asking me again. For the first few days, he bragged about small wins. Then he went quiet. When I asked what had happened, he exploded, actually shouted at me, something he had never done in 3 years together. Why do I owe you a report on every dollar I spend when you won't even help me? And slammed the bedroom door hard enough to rattle the hallway mirror. That was the moment I started to understand, really understand, that the man I'd married had quietly become someone else, or maybe had always been someone else, and I just hadn't seen it yet. Meanwhile, Carol and Brittany's requests for money hadn't stopped. If anything, once Weston had no income of his own, they's escalated, and worse, he started joining them. There was one particular evening I won't forget. The two of them showed up at our building unannounced, buzzed up, and stood in our hallway, loudly demanding I help family in a time of need. Weston standing next to them, nodding along like a hostage negotiator working for the other side. I gave them $300 that night purely to get them to leave, before a neighbor called the building manager about the noise. When I later asked for any of that money back, Carol actually laughed at me over the phone. It's $300. It's not going to hurt you. Don't be so cheap. Weston will pay you back. Weston never mentioned paying anything back, not once. I felt something harden in me that night, not rage exactly, something colder and more useful than rage. I started keeping a private log of every dollar lent, every date, every promise made and broken. I didn't tell Weston. I had a growing feeling I was going to need it. The day everything fully unraveled started ordinarily enough. Weston had told me he'd be spending the day at his parents' house. I used the free time to meet Doyle at the new Colonial. The tenants I'd placed there a month earlier were fully moved in, and Doyle wanted to walk the property with me to finalize a minor repair before signing off on the management contract. We were standing in the driveway when a car I recognized pulled up, Frank's old sedan, and out came Weston, Carol, Frank, and Brittany, each of them hauling actual suitcases. Rolling luggage, duffel bags. I genuinely thought for one confused second that they were headed somewhere and had just stopped by to say goodbye. Doyle looked as confused as I felt. Big bags for a walkthrough, he said to Weston, half joking. Weston grinned. An actual, proud grin, the kind you give when you think you're about to deliver dues. What are you talking about? We're moving in, I said genuinely. Moving in where? Carol beamed at me like we were sharing a wonderful secret. It's the 5-bedroom, right? We can finally all live together properly. I have to say, buying us a house this nice and not saying a word, you really do come from money, don't you? Doyle, to his credit, tried to intervene immediately. I explained the property to your husband when he came by last month, but I was never told the whole family would be relocating here today. This unit is currently occupied. Weston's face didn't change right away, like the words hadn't landed. Occupied? Faith didn't tell me anything about tenants. She was just being modest, hiding it to surprise everyone. That's when the actual tenants, a retired couple who'd signed an 18-month lease 3 weeks earlier, walked out the front door to see what the commotion was, and shook Doyle's hand, confirming out loud that yes, they lived there. Yes, they'd just moved in. I watched the exact moment the fantasy collapsed on Carol's face. Her smile didn't fade so much as it fell off entirely. What do you mean other people are living here? Weren't we all supposed to move in? Brittany threw her duffel bag down on the driveway hard enough that something inside it cracked. I was told it was a 5-bedroom, so obviously we were all moving in together. Frank, who I'd rarely heard raise his voice, was practically shouting. We already sold the house. We have nowhere to go back to. What are we supposed to do now? I turned to Weston, who had gone completely pale, and asked him directly. In front of everyone, did you tell your family we were all moving in here? Because I never said that. I never said anything close to that. He stammered something about having genuinely thought that's what was happening, that he'd seen the paperwork on the table and assumed. I let a beat of silence sit there, long enough for everyone to really absorb what he was admitting, that he had gone through my private documents, misunderstood them, and told his entire family we were relocating them into a house I'd never once mentioned to any of them. The blame, predictably, turned on him within about 30 seconds. Carol rounded on him first. How could you not check with her properly? This is exactly like you, always getting ahead of yourself. Brittany snapped that it was entirely his fault for causing this whole mess and that he needed to fix it. Frank just kept repeating, where are we supposed to live now? To no one in particular, like the question itself might solve the problem if he said it enough times. I turned to Doyle, kept my voice level, and said, can you find them a rental, please? And while you're at it, find me a one-bedroom for myself, somewhere quiet. That got Weston's attention fast. What do you mean? A place for yourself? What about me? You should live with your family, I told him. You clearly have a lot in common with them right now, and I'll need the money back that I lent your mother and sister over the past year and a half. Every dollar, I've kept records. I'll have the divorce paperwork sent to whatever address you end up at. Let me know once you're settled. I walked back to my car while his family dissolved into a shouting match behind me. Carol yelling at Frank, Brittany yelling at Weston. Weston stands there with his hands open, saying nothing useful to anyone. I didn't look back. I'd looked back at that family plenty already. I was done extending credit, financial or emotional. The divorce moved faster than I expected, mostly because I had nothing to hide and Weston had very little to fight with. What he and his family didn't count on was the paper trail. Every single loan I'd made to Carol and Brittany over 18 months, I'd made sure, after the first few, to get a signed acknowledgement for each one, a simple line stating the amount and a promise to repay. Nothing legally airtight, but more than enough to make my case cleanly to a judge, and, more importantly, to a collections attorney afterward. Carol's family scraped together repayment eventually, borrowed from relatives, from what I later heard was a fairly predatory short-term lender, humiliating themselves in the process to pay back a debt they'd assumed would just quietly disappear because I was family now. It didn't disappear. I made sure of that. I heard through mutual acquaintances, the kind of loose network that always keeps tabs on an ex, that things got hard for them afterward. Frank had already retired with a small pension. Weston never landed steady work again in the months right after, still chasing the idea that some app or some trading strategy was going to be his ticket out of an ordinary paycheck. Brittany and her son stayed in the cramped rental they'd downgraded into. The only income supporting 5 people in that house was Brittany's part-time retail job and whatever Frank's pension covered, which wasn't much. I heard there were debt collectors calling. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I mostly felt the specific, quiet relief of someone who has finally set down a weight they'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten. I moved into my new one-bedroom and, for the first time in years, felt something close to peace in my own home. I went back to the diner sometimes, late at night, just to sit with the noise. Nobody talked at me there anymore, and to my surprise, I found I liked the quiet just as much. About 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, my phone rang. It was Carol. Well, she said without any preamble, I hope you're happy with yourself. I asked her what she meant. You know exactly what I mean. Ruining this family over a house you were never even going to let us live in, and going after us for money like we're strangers off the street. I told her the money had never been a gift. Every loan had a signature on it, hers included, and that I'd been more than patient for far longer than any of them deserved. There was a pause, and then her voice shifted, softer, almost wheedling. Look, things are tight right now. If you were willing to help us out one more time, just to get back on our feet, we'd appreciate it. You're doing well for yourself. I know you are. I actually laughed, which surprised both of us. You spent 18 months assuming I was funny from you and resenting me for it. Now that the truth is inconvenient, you'd like me to go back to being your bank. We're still Weston's family, she said, like that settled something. You were never mine, I told her, and I meant it kindly, in the sense that I wasn't trying to wound her. I was just finally being honest. Maybe for the first time since I'd met her. I hope things get easier for you. But that's not going to be my problem to solve anymore. She hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't call back. These days my life looks almost exactly like it did before I met Weston, except lighter, in a way I didn't expect. I still go to the diner on slow weeknights. I still keep my finances mostly to myself, though these days it's less about protecting myself from being used and more just a private habit I've earned the right to keep. My properties are doing well. I closed on a fifth one last spring, a little duplex near the water, and I didn't tell a single soul until after the papers were signed. And honestly, that felt less like secrecy this time and more like simple, well-earned peace. Nobody gets to make me feel guilty for what I built with my own two hands ever again. Not a husband, not a mother-in-law, not anyone standing in a driveway with a suitcase, assuming a life that was never theirs to claim.